Okay friends, we're gonna learn how to make what's called a plushie. You're gonna learn how to sew, cut some felt, and then put some embellishments on just like this. I have created a couple of different ones that you can even later add a pin to put on your shirt or your backpack. But what we're gonna practice first is how to do different kinds of stitches. Now, if you know anything about sewing, which I don't know very much, I had to learn all of this to teach you, you need a lot of different things, but it's actually not as hard as you think it is. So what we're gonna need first is a practice piece that we're actually gonna keep in our sketchbooks, just like this. And we're gonna practice 3 different stitches. There's one called a running stitch. It looks like a dash line. There's one called the whip stitch, which is actually my favorite. You just whip it around every time you go through. There's the running stitch again. And then this one's called a blanket stitch. It kind of goes along the side of whatever you're stitching. I used the blanket stitch on this one. You can see how it kind of lines the edges all the way around. And I used the whip stitch on this one. It goes around and around and around. Think of it kind of like a loop-de-loop line. So you'll grab an artist trading card, choose a color of felt, and trace the artist trading card because that's the same size that we're gonna cut out. You can use a marker to trace, a pencil works fine too. It's a little awkward to trace onto felt because it's like a fabric, but trace it enough to where you can see your lines really good to cut it. Now, cutting felt is a little bit difficult. You kind of have to practice a little bit, and it's okay if your lines are a little jagged, just do your best. Once you have your artist trading card sample cut out, we're gonna practice some stitches on there. So you'll need a needle. Now, this is very important. These are sharp, but if you use them correctly, they will not hurt you. I'm gonna take my needle and set it to the side while I choose my color of string. I'm gonna help you measure how much string you actually need because we're going around our whole sample one time without getting more string. So I'll have the right amount of string for you. Now, to thread the eye of your needle, which is the part that the string goes in, you can usually the holes are big enough that you can usually just stick it right inside and pull it through. But if it's a little bit difficult for you, there's a little trick. We take a teeny tiny little piece of paper, fold it in half like a hot dog. This piece of paper should fit right through the eye of my needle, just like this. So I take my string, put it inside my paper, hold it in there, and thread my needle with the paper, holding the yarn or string inside. And what happens is, voila, my string is now inside the eye of my needle. Now, we're gonna make our ends best friends. So I've got both of my ends. I'm gonna tie them in a knot. Now here's a really easy overhand knot. Take it, wrap it around your finger, just like this. Pull that loop off your finger, and then put those ends through the loop, and then push that knot all the way towards the end. That knot is super important because it's gonna help the string not go through my felt. So now what I'm gonna do is make sure that this has been pulled nice and tight. And what you're gonna do first is just poke through and pull. You can even go from the back. I like to start from the front. Either one is fine with me. And pull it to where your string is being held tight by your knot. Now, if you pull too hard, it will come through your felt, so don't pull too hard. Now, what we're gonna start with is the running knot, the running stitch. We're gonna start with the running stitch. The running stitch, if you're looking at it sideways, just goes up, down, kind of like a wavy line, but when you look at it, it looks like a dash line. So what I'm gonna do, now that I've gone through the front, my string is here, I'm gonna pick about my finger's width away or a little bit closer and put my needle in. So now it's coming from the back to the front, and pull all of my string until there is no more left. Now, if I pull it too hard, it's gonna start to do what's called bunching. I don't want this to bunch, so I'm not gonna pull it that hard. I'm just gonna very lightly pull it until there's no string left to pull. Now I've just come this way. Now I'm gonna go down this way. Now be careful, watch your fingers. You don't wanna get your finger in the way of the needle. If you just poke yourself just a little bit, it doesn't hurt and you will not bleed. Don't go too fast and don't push too hard. So it's just the same in and out, in and out, in and out, up and down. It's kind of like when we weave, we go over, under, over, under. This one we go back to front, back to front. And when you're all done, it should look like you have a nice dashed line going across the side of your felt piece. Now, what's very important in sewing is to make it look uniform or even. So what I'm trying really hard to do is to make the space the same. Every time I go in, I'm using the same amount of space. Now that I'm in the corner, this is going to be my last one for my dash line, and we're going to do the whip stitch, which is my favorite. So what I'm going to do next, I've come from the front to the back. So every time on this edge, I'm going to go from the front to the back and bring it back around, front, back. So front to the back here, front to the back here. This actually should be like this. It should all be kind of like diagonal dash lines when we're all done. So I went from the front to the back, pulled it to the front, put it in the front. If it's easier, you can hold it a little sideways. That's fine too. Make sure to keep them nice and uniform. So keep the spacing the same between each of them. Always make sure that when you're pushing to the back that your finger is not accidentally in the way of your needle. And pull it taut. Taut means it's tight enough, but not too tight. So the only rule on this one is I'm always going through the front. See? Not that hard. Now when I go back up to my short side, I'm gonna practice my running stitch again, which is just kind of like over under when we weave. So if I'm front to back, now I go back to front. Always making sure that you're aware of where your fingers are, because if you are going like this and your thumb is in the way, it will poke you. But remember, if you feel a poke, just stop. That way you don't accidentally poke your finger. You can go as slow as you need to, and the more you do it, the more it will make sense. Now for my blanket stitch. This one is the most confusing, and it took me a couple tries. So if you don't even want to try the blanket stitch, you don't have to. You could practice the whip stitch again, but I'm going to show you the blanket stitch. It's just like the whip stitch with one thing that's different, and let me show you what that is. So I went from the front to the back, so I'm going to come around to the front, go through the back, but instead of just pulling it, what I'm going to do is come through. See how when I pulled it a little bit, it made this loop? I'm just going to stick my needle through that loop and pull it like this. Let me do that again. Go from the front to the back, pull it a little bit, see my loop, put my needle down inside. It's almost like I'm threading my needle through that loop before I pull. And what happens when I do that is the stitch, when I pull it, lines the side like this. It's almost like a slip knot, or when you tie your shoes, how you have the loops, the bunny ears that you use when you tie your shoes, you just kind of go through the bunny loop like this and then pull it tight. Pull, find your loop, go inside, Now, when you finish, we will tie it off into a knot. It's really quite simple. I'm gonna go in and finish my blanket knot. Now what I'm gonna do is go back, just pick a spot, doesn't matter where. Go back inside and then go through the loop again, like that. And then it ties up nice and tight, and then we can cut it off. And there you have it, a sampling of a whole bunch of different types of stitches. We have the running stitch, we have the whip stitch, and we have the blanket stitch. And remember, if you just want to practice 2 of them, that is fine, because the blanket stitch is a little bit confusing. Now, with your needle, you'll bring it right back to me when you're done. You'll take your extra string out and throw it in the trash. Okay, now that we've practiced our stitches, what we're gonna do is actually create our plushie. So the first thing you need to do, we are all going to be using this shape because it's the first project that we've ever done like this. Everybody's gonna have a circle, but you do get to choose your color. You're going to trace, there's gonna be a couple of different sizes of circles that you can use, but you need to pick the same size and do it twice. So I've chosen this size and I've traced it twice, and you're gonna cut it out. Save your scraps, we'll use those for filling. Now what you're gonna do is you're going to pin them together. So I have these little sharp pins, and I only need one. I'm gonna match them up in the way that I think they look the closest. And I'm going to pin them together, which just means I'm using the pin to hold them together. So I go through and back just like this. So that way it holds my circles together so they're not going to move. So now what I need is my needle again, and this part is super easy because we've practiced once before. So now I get to choose whether or not I want to do the running stitch, the whip stitch, or the blanket stitch. Remember, the running stitch is the easiest. The whip stitch I think is the second easiest, the second hardest, and then the blanket stitch is the hardest. So pick a spot, it doesn't matter where you start, and the front or the back, it doesn't matter. Now we're actually sewing through 2 pieces of felt, so it's gonna be a little bit trickier, but it's the exact same as we did on our practice one. So I'm gonna do the whip stitch, which means if I go in through the front, I have to go in through the front on all of these. Now, once we get to about 3 to 4 fingers worth of space, we're gonna take our pin out. Make sure that we don't lose it or someone might accidentally stick themselves, so put it back in the box. And then we need to fill it with stuffing. Now you have a couple of different options of stuffing. We have leftover scraps that we can use to stuff inside. We have a bunch of plastic bags that you can use, which is fun because then when you squish it, it gives it a little bit of a noise. And then there's always a little bit of stuffing as well. Now this is obviously way too much to fit into my teeny tiny stuffy, but what I'm gonna use is actually a plastic bag to show you how much you need. Now, start small. You may not need very much. You might just need 1 bag. Stuff it looks like a fortune cookie. So now what I can do is tighten up that part that got loose from me stuffing it up and then finish the edge. Now when we're right here at the edge and it's time to tie it, I almost don't have enough string, but what I'm gonna do is feed it back through to create a knot. This part is a little bit tricky, so if you need my help, I don't mind helping you. And then when you're ready, cut off those ends on the first part and the last part. And then if it's a little bit wonky, you can kind of move your stuffing around to get it to where you want it to go. And there we have our very own stuffy, or a plushie. Here we go. Now, in order to add fun little embellishments like this right here, you can take our extra scraps of felt and cut out any kind of shape that you want, and then use this tacky glue to tack it on. It'll take it a day or two to fully dry so that this piece won't come off, but then it's stuck on there really, really good. And you can decorate it however you would like. You can do polka dots, you can turn it into a donut, you could do stars, hearts, you could turn it into an emoji face, you could draw on it with markers. Just remember, whatever you put on there is gonna stay for a long time.